Welcome to the 2024 Lake Oscawana Management Advisory Commission annual meeting. We are delighted to have so many of you with us this morning. We are going to have a presentation this morning from our longtime limnologist, Hillary Kenyon, who has been working with us for, I don't even know how many years at this point. She used to be with Northeast Aquatic Resources, but 2 years ago she went out on her own and has her own company, and we have hired her to continue being the limnologist for Lake Oscawana. As all of you know, our lake has been battered in the last couple of years. In the summer of 2023, we had a 100-year storm that flooded the lake and caused enormous disruption to our ability to use it for the summer. And now we have a drought, and the lake, by my measurement, is almost 2 feet below normal. These are not events which necessarily help our lake, but we are doing the best to manage what we can. This morning, Hillary is going to give you a presentation on the current status of the lake. We will have a question and answer period at the end, so if you have questions, please jot them down, and at the end we'll open it up to questions, and Hillary will be happy to respond to your questions. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Hillary. Take it away.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. I know Saturday morning meetings aren't the easiest sometimes, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Thanks again for LOMAC and the town. I'm really excited to continue working with the Lake Oscawana group. As he said, I have started my own company, Applied Watershed Sciences, but I'm still working as a limnologist, certified lake manager, and I'm going to dig in some details about the 2024 season for you guys here. So can you hear me okay, Alan?
I certainly can. Kelvin,
Great.
Kelvin, I just got an email that somebody's waiting to get in. Can you just watch the waiting room for us, please?
Awesome. So
I've just let everybody else in before you just said that. So everybody should be in the waiting room. Not out of the waiting room. I apologize.
All right, so I'm going to start with a really simple quote from, I think, Albert Einstein. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think I'm just putting this in here because I know when I talk about numbers and I know when I talk about graphs and figures, this is not something that people see every day. I try to simplify things a little, but I don't want you guys to get lost. So if you have questions about something or you want me to stop and re-explain something in a slightly different way, I'd be happy to do so. Please type something into the chat if you're on your computer, and Alan and I will both do our best to stop and continue explaining something if necessary. And if you want at the end, also, I can go back to another slide and help answer questions at that time as well. So the details are important, and I want to communicate it as best as possible. So a brief outline for today's presentation. I'm going to just revisit the goals from the Lake and Watershed Management Plan. Then we'll talk about the 2024 water quality update and how Oscawana is doing today. And then I want to go a little bit more into cyanobacteria blooms and how recent weather events and change over time and the dramatic change in aquatic plants all sort of ties into why you might be seeing a little bit more of cyanobacteria in recent years. Then we'll talk about the severe difference in aquatic plants over the last few years, and then bridge everything back into watershed management, stormwater management, and then the QA session. So to revisit these goals, our three main goals identified in the watershed-based plan was to manage and prevent the invasive aquatic plant species and nuisance growth of certain native aquatic plant species. Obviously, that has changed a lot in the past couple of years. The grass carp have been exceedingly successful in reducing the Eurasian milfoil populations, but unfortunately, they've also taken out some of the native plants. And so that structure and the way that nutrients are recycled with the aquatic plants has also influenced how nutrients and harmful cyanobacteria blooms happen in the lake. So those recent late summer to fall increases in cyanobacteria or harmful algal blooms abbreviated HABs. That's going to become a little bit more important as we manage going forward, because obviously aquatic plants is a little bit less of a steaming bullet here. And then finally, we're trying to always strike a balance between the recreation and the ecology. I've heard from some folks that there's concerns about fisheries management, mostly related to the extreme loss of aquatic plants in the littoral zone. And so I can hopefully answer some questions about what we're doing about that in the future. So just to start, the water clarity in 2024 was fairly average overall. This figure, if you can see my pointer right here, is starting at the top of the lake and looking down into the bottom of the lake. And the Secchi disc is how we measure water clarity. And basically that is lowering the disc off of the side of the boat using a view scope to shade out the peripheral vision and reflectance. And the farthest you see the disc into the lake, that's how clear the water is. In really clear water, you'll have a greater value. In turbid water with a lot of phytoplankton, you're probably not going to see anything greater than this 2-meter threshold. So this 2-meter threshold here is what was identified in the plan, in the Lake and Watershed Management Plan, as your minimum target threshold for clarity, particularly for late summer. Unfortunately, we didn't quite exceed it, but we were like hovering on that line of the minimum acceptable values in late summer. The blue dashed line here is your threshold for really excellent clarity for Oscawana. And we also had an exceedance there, which is good. That's a good thing. That means that clarity is some of the best clarity that we've seen at Oscawana, and that occurred at the beginning of June, end of May time period. The gray dashed line here is the overall 7-year average, which is very similar to like the long-term historical average as well. Overall, the pattern that we see from early spring to the late fall period is very similar to what we saw in 2022 and 2023. And it seems to me that the pattern has actually become more pronounced over the last few years for a number of factors. It is typical, I should say, of spring clarity to be worse than the middle of the summer or the beginning of the summer or the late spring, simply because watershed loading tends to be higher in the winter and in the spring period. And so you get more runoff from the watershed at this point. And then as you get into the fall, your clarity in the fall is usually related more to, I consider, internal load or internal recycling of nutrients. And I'll explain that a little bit more in case, just as a review, because I know people have heard it before. But ultimately, the clarity was okay in 2024, but I'd really like to see late summer better conditions, pushing this value closer to the average. It doesn't have to reach the average, but a little bit better than average, and below that 2-meter threshold is what we're looking for. So I've spoken about internal versus external nutrient loading a number of times with this group, but just in case there's anybody new that wants the background here, this is a map of the watershed of Oscawana. And any rainfall or pollution that happens on the land uphill of Oscawana eventually is either going to run off into streams, it's going to run off into culverts from the streets, or it's going to end up into the groundwater filtering as it goes towards Lake Oscawana. That is what we consider the external nutrient load. And when I say nutrients, I'm referring to phosphorus and nitrogen, because those are the two primary elements that grow plants and algae in the lake. So that external nutrient load has to go somewhere, and it ends up settling partially in the lake itself, and it accumulates over time in the lake sediments. So over 100 years of watershed loading, you have what develops is a legacy amount of nutrients in the lake sediments that could potentially be released on an annual basis throughout the summer. And we refer to that as the internal load. So the internal load can happen in both oxygenated and non-oxygenated conditions, but it is the loss of summer bottom water oxygen that facilitates the rapid release of certain types of phosphorus and nitrogen.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yep.
This is a really good point to make. So it's that watershed, that broad watershed that ends up in the lake, which is why LOMAC has held programs over the last couple of years on buffer zones and rain gardens and rain barrels. Anything that we as landowners can do to reduce the runoff into the lake is of enormous value to the future of the lake. Because most of the land is either forest, which we can't control, or private property, which LOMAC and the town can't control, but we as homeowners can. Anything we can do, because our homes produce an enormous amount of runoff from its roofs, from the septic systems, from our gardens, anything we can do to limit the external loading is of enormous value to the future of the lake.
Yeah. And so to build on that, I want to introduce a concept called impervious cover, which basically means that if water falls on the ground, the natural forested ground, it's able to percolate into the soils and filter naturally and go as shallow groundwater to Lake Oscawana. But if you have a building or a road or some type of impervious cover that's preventing it from infiltrating into the ground, then that water runs off and doesn't get treated at all by the natural soils. And instead, it just continues to pick up speed, pick up erosion, pick up more pollutants along the way, and ends up relatively unfiltered directly into the lake. And so that is what stormwater is, and why stormwater monitoring is important, and why stormwater management is important. So if we have serious erosion events, there's very little that we can do right now to prevent that. And the way that you minimize the volume of water that happens on road runoff or on house runoff is by trying to capture it in small locations on your personal property, preventing roof gutters from going onto the road, preventing your driveway runoff from going onto the road. Small types of little catchment areas or rain gardens are really important. And I'll talk about that again at the end, because we're going to try to solicit feedback from the community to see who's interested in getting some more tailored advice for their own personal properties. So that we have the external load and the internal load, and they are interrelated in many, many ways. One thing I wanted to point out here is that this internal recycling is made worse by climate change. Climate change dramatically impacts the summer temperature. It dramatically impacts the length of time that the bottom water is thermally isolated due to a density gradient of the thermocline. And that means that you're going to see more oxygen loss and worse summer conditions all around in the lake with climate change. So it's something to pay attention with, and I will talk about it a little bit more. So let's just jump into the temperature and dissolved oxygen from Station 1, which is the deep hole on the basically right at the mouth of the Wildwood area. It's about 10.5 meters deep, about 35 feet deep. And what you see is as the temperature, as the season progresses, so this is the late March temperature profile, where this is the top of the lake and this is the bottom of the lake. You have basically the same temperature from the top to the bottom in March, but as your air temperature warms, so does your water, and the surface water warms much faster than the bottom waters. And what you get is that rapid zone of temperature change called the thermocline. And if you were to dive down in the lake, you would feel that dramatic temperature change with depth. And this is really important because it drives this oxygen condition in the bottom waters. So moving over to the dissolved oxygen, or the DO figure here, it's sort of the opposite. We start with better dissolved oxygen, so higher dissolved oxygen in the spring, and then slowly but surely, the lake loses oxygen much faster at the bottom. And this vertical line here is the line that represents 1 milligram per liter of dissolved oxygen in the water column. And you can see that anything below that, so anything between 0 and that 1 threshold here, is considered anoxic or doesn't have any oxygen left. And what happens every season is that you start to get a creeping of anoxic conditions from the lake bottom all the way up to, in 2024, our maximum was in the end of August at about 5 meters, which is a little bit better than 2023, but still a whole meter above or worse than our target threshold goal that was set in the Lake and Watershed Management Plan. So 6 meters is where we really ideally want to have the maximum anoxia persist. If we go higher than that in the water column, that represents, I know it's only 1 meter vertically, but it's a huge volume of water spread across the entire surface area of the lake at that depth. So that basically dramatically increases the risk of cyanobacteria blooms if we can't get a hold of that anoxia throughout the year. And one of the ways that that does that is because when it rises so high, when it reaches 5 meters, it's now in the middle of the thermocline. It's not below the thermocline anymore. So when it's in the middle of the thermocline, that means that surface algae, like cyanobacteria, can start to use those nutrients much more readily. And that in itself is a trigger for blooms. So if there's no questions, I'll go on to talking about nutrients, particularly total phosphorus. So these figures show the surface layer, or the epilimnion layer. And this is from about the top of the water column down to probably about 3 or 4 meters at maximum throughout the year. But we collect our surface samples at 1 meter, just for representation purposes over the historical monitoring period. Anything that's in this red box here is considered poor for surface waters in Oscawana. And we did have a couple exceedances at each station in 2024. This was really high. And I think that this result was a direct implication of active cyanobacteria accumulating nutrients at or close to the surface at that time of year. And that was towards the end of the season, right at the beginning of when the lake started mixing in the fall. So overall, what I want you to see here is that we've had exceedances in the past, but there does, particularly at stations 2 and 3, seem to be an increase in surface total phosphorus over time. And that is really what we're trying to manage here. All lake management is trying to keep the ball from like rolling downhill. There's a lot of effort that is required to prevent what we consider eutrophication or nutrient enrichment over time, because that is like the general trajectory with people in the watershed, is to put more nutrients into the water body that they live in. And a lot of times this happens really fast. And so we have the data to suggest it's happening fairly slowly, and that there's a lot that we can do to prevent it from getting worse over time, which is what we've been doing all along. And then the take home from this slide here is that 2024 surface total phosphorus was higher than average. And unfortunately, some of the late season total phosphorus that we saw in the surface waters was some of the highest readings over the last several years. All right, you can forgive me in advance for putting a bunch of numbers on the screen, but this is the bottom layer summary of nutrients over the 2017 to 2024 time period, so the last 7 years. On the left is both total phosphorus and total nitrogen, so total phosphorus here, total nitrogen here, for all 3 stations, including the deep station as station 1. The only thing that's different over here is I took out the station 1. So this is just station 2 and station 3. And what you can see is that the maximum over here is so much higher than the maximum at stations 2 and station 3 over that long-term trend. And that's simply because the stations 2 and 3 are shallower, and they're anoxic for a shorter period of time. They have less accumulation of phosphorus and nitrogen over that time period. And it is normal for the deeper stations to have a higher range of phosphorus concentration and nitrogen concentration. Another thing to look at here is that the minimum and maximum range is enormous. Like this 74 to 5325, that means that there's an enormous range in concentration in the bottom waters of both nitrogen and phosphorus. And the reason for that is because it starts off fairly low, and then as it progresses through the season, you get this rapid uptick, which is kind of hard to graph because these values over here just seem like nothing compared to the massive maximum values that we see. So that's why I use numbers instead of a figure here. takeaway here is that the 2024 bottom nutrients were higher than average at all three stations. Unfortunately, the maximum concentrations viewed at station 1 were the highest that I've seen since 2017. So that's something to take away. I think this is related both to the extreme loss of aquatic plants and how that changes the nutrients over time, but it also is potentially related to the weather and the severe heat waves that we've been seeing over the summer and how that changes the recycling of nutrients. I think I just answered that question that Jenny posted, what could be causing the rapid uptick in nutrients? So there's always going to be an uptick every season in nutrients in the bottom, which is directly related to the internal load, but partially also related to watershed settling. It's both. But the dramatic increase this year is probably more weather related. And because these numbers are complicated, and I know that people don't look at them every day, I'm planning to talk to LOMAC and the town and to come up with some sort of new tracking metric to make this all easier to understand. And we're going to include that in the 2024 summary report. So come up with some sort of a percentage or a letter grade to make it more translatable for folks. So those nutrients, there's a lot more nutrient data that I'm not going to show you today, but it will be in the 2024 report. I didn't want to bombard everybody with a lot of figures. So I'm going to talk more generally about why nutrients are important to phytoplankton, but why also temperature is something we need to be paying a lot of attention to. So nutrients fuel the phytoplankton that grows in the water column and the algae and the cyanobacteria that grows in the water column. But in order for cyanobacteria specifically to thrive, the temperature conditions need to be right. Cyanobacteria thrive with warmer springs, increased summer temperatures, warmer autumns, drier summers. Basically, everything that comes with climate change, cyanobacteria now have a competitive advantage over other types of algae. So historically, in the spring, we would see a large amount of diatoms, and maybe towards the May and June period, you'd start to see a different type of algae called green algae. And then it really wasn't until the July through September period that you would start to see blue-greens. And then usually towards the fall, eventually it might switch back to diatoms. And this is the typical algae succession that scientists in the Northeast have been using to understand lakes for 50 plus years. But unfortunately, climate change is changing that. So if we have warmer temperatures in April and they persist higher into the season and then longer into the season with higher temperatures, that means that blue-greens have that competitive advantage for a much longer time. So blue-greens, aka cyanobacteria. And that's something to be aware of. So in thinking about what Oscawana needs for management, I'm referring back to the Lake and Watershed Management Plan from 2020, and I'd really like to discuss with the town and LOMAC about adding on a focused cyanobacteria action plan, which it sounds more complicated than it is. Really, all it is I want to have folks around the lake in the community help LOMAC and the town and me better track these blooms, when they happen and where they happen and how long they happen for. I see a question I'm just going to answer. It says, does the drought and lower lake condition affect nutrient concentration? Yes, it does. So it's twofold though. So there'll be lower nutrients coming in from the watershed, but the drought condition also concentrates the volume of water and the amount of nutrients in that volume. So technically the concentration could be higher if there was a lower amount of water coming in and a ton of evaporation, that you lose the water that then holds a lot of the existing nutrients. But nutrient form is really important. So the nutrients coming from the watershed have various forms. They can be in bioavailable phosphate and nitrate types of nutrients, or they can be in non-immediately bioavailable phosphorus bound to organic material, or tied up in leaves, or tied up in sediment bound to sediment particles. So it's the quantity doesn't necessarily immediately affect how the algae respond to it. So the quantity of nutrients coming in could make the lake very, very turbid. If it's like a large flooding event, you'll definitely see that in the water clarity readings. But you might not immediately see more algae. It might just be more turbid because some of that is going to be first bound to sediment particles and organic matter, and it has to be decomposed by microbes before the algae can actually use it. But that does happen over time. So sometimes there's a lagged effect with algae as well after major storms. So again, I'd like to, if possible, see better reporting. This was a bloom that happened in the end of August at Hilltop Beach. This is where the photo was taken, and it was confirmed by the Department of Health. But this is the only photo we have. And I'm pretty certain, based on the nutrient concentrations and the water quality data, that there were a lot more blooms that nobody has photos or records of. And that's unfortunate because the photo says, photo tells 1,000 words kind of thing, or 1,000, I don't even know what that saying is, but it helps me understand how big the bloom is and whether or not it's a small ephemeral event that might just dissipate with the wind picking up in a different direction, or if it's a full lake-wide event that we can expect the bloom to persist for weeks on end. I'm going to talk about aquatic plants and cyanobacteria in just a minute, so I'm going to hold off on a couple questions that just popped up. But basically, I would really like some better tracking, better communication, and record keeping about those public health and beach closures. I think we've talked about a few beach closures that have happened in the past, but I want to start incorporating those into the formal record of the annual reports. And in case people are going back, this is a great link to the New York HAB website. Got a lot of really awesome information that'll update people. But ultimately, with this CyanoHab action plan, tracking is good, but at some point, if climate change impacts become so pronounced that you start to see beach closures in certain areas for weeks on end, which is what is happening in a lot of lakes across the country and across the state, there's options to manage cyanobacteria, whether it be use of algicides or phosphorus binding agents. Those are both possible solutions, but we really need to discuss these way ahead of time, determine if there's support from the community and the town and LOMAC to use certain types of products. And then that permitting process is like at least a year in general. So I've talked about some phosphorus binding agents before. There are also environmentally friendly versions of both algicides and phosphorus binders, where some of the phosphorus binders are literally just a type of clay mineral that binds with phosphate in the water column. And some algicides are more peroxide-based algicides, so it's similar to like what you kill germs with in your mouth using peroxide mouthwash, but at much higher concentrations that would then affect the algae.
Hillary, can I just interject for a second? So if anybody has during the season a photo that they want to give us, we have a website that you can send your photo to, and then we can forward it to Hillary. So,
Yeah.
so we have a website. Just send us your photo. If you have your geotagging on it, it will be perfect for Hillary. She has all the geo data. And that is how we're going to keep Hillary up to date.
Yep. And I'm just going to add to that. So the Lake Oscawana management at gmail.com is a Gmail account. So it has access to Google Photos. So you can share directly from Google Photos, but you have to mark that you want to share location sharing, because if you just share it from Google Photos or an email, it's not going to maintain the geolocation data. So it's better to share it through the Google Photos app, if possible, directly with that website or that Gmail account, and then tag the sharing location on. A lot of questions just came in here, so I'm trying to look at them as they came in. I do want to talk about algicides because I'm not going to expand on too many options here now, but like there are limited tools available to us to be able to combat the cyanobacteria harmful algal blooms, which I shall see in the next slide. They're happening all over. New York. It's not, and the country really. So this was just a public service announcement for if you see a scum like this, don't let your kids, don't let your dogs swim in water like this. It's a high probability in scums that toxins will be present. And that if the water is generally clear, the toxin risk is very low. It's really the scums that present the health risk. So this is a map of all of the cyanobacteria HABs that were confirmed by Department of Health and DES or DEC, sorry, in 2024. And out west or to the central part of the state, a lot of these are directly related to agricultural runoff. So like the blooms that are happening in the Finger Lakes, there's a lot of agriculture in those areas and a lot of runoff pollution. The Adirondack Lakes are even recently seeing some cyanobacteria HABs. They're much smaller events, not nearly as persistent as a lot of the other locations in New York. But this can be directly linked to climate change. Somebody asked, I'm going to talk about the ongoing commitment with this community and stuff like algicides before moving forward. So I'm not suggesting that algicides are used regularly. I consider algicides as sort of like a Band-Aid treatment, but they're useful if you have a smaller bloom in an area like a swimming beach on a district beach, and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to use the lake for the remainder of the season. It's a really good way to keep that area open for recreation and prevent the blooms from getting worse. So really what it does is it knocks it back and it gives you a few weeks, sometimes more, depending upon your nutrient concentrations of control. And there's new research that's come out of the Army Corps of Engineers, like environmental research database, and their new report is suggesting the use of peroxide-based algicides preemptively to prevent cyanobacteria aconite generation, which is their little seed that starts in the sediment surface, is actually really effective in both preventing blooms in that season, but also reducing the quantity that can then seed the next season of growth. So there is a little bit more utility for algicide treatments than I think people give it credit for. I should also mention that there's copper-based algicides that are frequently used all across the state, and I'm not in any way suggesting that we use algicide regularly on a regimen. Like a lot of the lakes in close to New York City have been treating with algicides for 30 years, and it's basically they're adding so much product to the lake that the copper will start to accumulate in the sediments, which does become a concern, and I'm hyper aware of that.
Hillary, there are a couple of, before we go on, there are a couple of questions maybe we should respond to, like,
Sure.
Can we get rid of the carp, decrease their population? One, so that the question is, are they what's causing the problem? And then there's one about, are these huge houses being built also causing an alarming increase in phosphorus loading? They could, but I will tell you that the zoning board is making sure that any new houses that are built have a certain amount of permeable property around it, and are requiring houses to have rain gardens and runoff preventative measures, so that's actually a benefit. Why don't you answer the carp question?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about carp later in the presentation, but just to get into it a little bit right now, yes, it is possible to remove grass carp. Other lakes have been doing it. Particularly Candlewood Lake is working with Connecticut DEP to remove some of their grass carp. The way that is done is by using electrofishing boats and corralling them into shallow zones and then netting them out or bow hunting them out. And it is possible to remove them, but we're not sure we're there yet. We've started discussing it as a possibility for the future, but there's also a natural die-off, and the carp start to slow down in growth over time too. So we don't want to remove too many carp. Like, you guys put them in for a reason. They've done a good job of getting rid of the invasive milfoil. And I know that both the aquatic plants, the native aquatic plants, and the milfoil will rebound if you remove too many of grass carp. So it's something to be aware of. We are trying to strike that balance, though, so it is on the table. And then in terms of runoff, So larger houses that are constructed, like Alan said, should be able to infiltrate all of the water that they generate as a runoff. So if you have a rain garden on your property, that's like the ideal situation for infiltrating water. A rain garden works by accumulating runoff from a 24-hour period and then infiltrating all of the runoff in about 24 to 48 hours. It's not a rain garden if it's got standing water in it more than 48 hours. That's something to be aware of. You might not have the right soils to have an adequately functioning rain garden, in which case you might need to do something different on your property. So I think the term rain garden is thrown around sort of loosely, but other types of filtration and best management practices are specific to certain types of soils and landscape regimes. I'm going to keep going here. All right, so what the new monitoring that was done for cyanobacteria in 2024 was a type of pigment monitoring. So I invested in a new probe that measures fluorometry of chlorophyll and phycocyanin. And this is a table of some of the phycocyanin readings from 2024. And this probe reports in relative fluorescence units, or RFUs. And basically what it does is it shines a very specific wavelength of light at the various phytoplankton in the water column. And the phytoplankton are going to fluoresce back at a specific wavelength that the meter can then also measure. You can create models to calibrate and convert these RFU values into micrograms per liter, which would then be similar to the values that people report from like taking a sample, filtering it, running a spectrophotometer in the lab, which takes a lot longer. And they are accurate to some degree, but really for our purposes, we don't need that specific number. What we need to see is where the cyanobacteria are and where they are the most dominant, which was really interesting because you can see here that they're most dominant in the late June, so early summer to midsummer, in the top of the anoxic boundary zone. So that tells me that cyanobacteria are capable of using nutrients from the deep water area, and they're hanging out at the mid-depth range early in the spring, which gives us an early warning that if there was a major storm event and this layer of water was disrupted in any way, it could stimulate a surface bloom where all of a sudden the phytoplankton and the cyanobacteria that you don't see that are down halfway in the water column migrate to the surface and then start forming surface scums. Historically, the monitoring of phytoplankton only really measured the top 3 meters. So we were missing all of this valuable information. So the new technology that exists make it much easier to predict blooms, track blooms, and determine what the best timing is and what the best course of action for management is. Something that I haven't discussed with the town or LOMAC yet, so hopefully it's okay that I included it in this public presentation, but I really think that we should move towards doing some sediment sampling. Very limited amount, but because of climate change and because watershed management is slow, progress is slow, we can really only work on a couple projects a year if it's not talking about private property and people doing things on their own property. We have a lot of ideas for watershed management, but the grant funding to do that is only once a year. And then you need to have the people able to implement that and the highway department. And there's a lot of moving parts to get watershed improvements happening. So in the meantime, we should start to think about how much phosphorus is in the lake sediments and how much it would actually cost to potentially remove that phosphorus from the sediments in a way using a phosphorus binding treatment like Phoslock or Utrosorb. Those are 2 of the products that are very commonly used across the country, or alum, one of the older products. I have not spent a lot of time talking about these before because New York still doesn't have a permitting route for this. New York is, like, to my knowledge, one of maybe less than 3 states in the country that doesn't have a permitting route to use these types of in-lake phosphorus binding agents. And it's because the way the federal Pesticide Management Act is written, these are not pesticides at all. They're not. They're not claiming to be pesticides. They're not pesticides. They don't kill anything. All they do is bind phosphorus in the same way that we use it, all these products in drinking water treatment, wastewater treatment, even some aluminum-based phosphate binders are used in people's blood for certain conditions. And so we need a pathway to permit these in New York, but the DEC isn't there yet. I think there's a lot of political pressure right now to manage HABs in the state, and the 2 pilot treatments that were done in New York are still being evaluated, and we're really just waiting for DEC to figure out what law they're going to use to be able to allow certain products and what that permitting is going to look like. Excuse me. So if we plan now, we can discuss options, think about how much it's going to cost, because these types of treatments are not cheap, but they do work incredibly well. And then maybe if the state gets up to par with the rest of the country on allowing certain products, it could happen. But we're a far way out for that. So I'm going to shift gears now to aquatic plants. A lot of you have asked questions about whether the dramatic change in the aquatic plant community affects the nutrients in the water column, and the answer is yes.
Hillary, before you go on, somebody has asked whether dredging is an option.
Dredging is extremely costly, and it is not practical for water deeper than about 5 feet deep. Most of the dredging operators for small freshwater bodies use a dredging machine that has a cutter head with the hose that will do suction dredging, so it disturbs the sediment, which means that you can only operate in shallow water. It is not the shallow water zones that are contributing the majority of the phosphorus to the cyanobacteria. It is the deeper water zones. So if dredging were to happen in shallow waters, you wouldn't see a comparative improvement in cyanobacteria because you weren't affecting those deep water areas. So if you think about it like the lake being a cone, things are going to slide downhill, right? So if you have sediment accumulating up here, it's going to slowly migrate down here. And it's only in the deep, deep waters where you have the super fines that are able to settle, because in the shallow water, you've got wind action, you've got wave energy, you've got disruption. It just like constantly resuspends it. And it's only once it settles in the deep water, that's where it really stays. Unless you're in a wetland area like Abley Cove. In that case, there are still fine sediments over there. But generally, I don't view dredging as a feasible option for controlling internal nutrient loading like I do phosphate binders. It's just too expensive, too deep, and too much area. Like we would be talking about like easily $5 million for a large scale dredging project. And I don't think that's something that the town can do right now, even with outside funding. All right, I got a lot of questions coming in. Could our state senator and assembly representatives, yes, definitely help get alum, etc., permittable from the DEC? That is something that I think has been pushed a lot recently. There's a lot of lake groups and a lot of watershed management groups that have been pushing for use, because these products are also available for use in the watershed. So they work the same way they do in the lake, but they can also work in the watershed. And I know Roaring Brook has experimented with some watershed-based applications of a product called Utrisorb filters, but what's in the filter bag that goes in a stream or in a culvert is the exact same product that ends up in the lake to bind phosphorus in the lake. It just works better in non-moving water because there's a longer contact time. Somebody else asked whether runoff might be slowed if all sandy beach communities landscaped and creating rain gardens. Yes. So if you infiltrate your water runoff from your property, that will allow the rainwater to not run off and instead get treated by being filtered through the natural soils. That is like the ultimate way to reduce runoff and nutrients coming from your property. It's important in rain gardens to use native plants that don't require fertilizers. So native plants that can tolerate certain levels of being wet and dry. There's a lot of really good resources out there about plantings regimes, that I can talk with LOMAC and the town. Maybe we can post some on the website in the future to help everybody.
But we also have our program, which is recorded and available on the LOMAC website of our program with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Putnam County on buffer zones and rain gardens, and they have a whole list of plants in there.
And somebody else said, are some of the larger boats contributing to the turnover of phosphates and not letting them settle? Yes, that is definitely possible. So states like Vermont and New Hampshire have come to start regulating wake boats, and wake areas where wake boats can operate have to be deeper than a certain depth. The larger the wake that's produced, the deeper that disturbance goes into the water column. And so if you're disturbing sediments in shallow water zones with large boat action, you're definitely stirring up the nutrients and allowing more of it to move from the bottom to the surface waters. It's not the primary method of like nutrient management, but it will help. And I know there's a lot of shallow water bodies that have struggled with that. Okay, so let's move back to, I think I answered most of the questions. Let's move back to aquatic plants, and talking about the dramatic changes we've seen over the last few years. So this is a recap. The original 2016 grass carp stocking, we didn't see any change all the way through 2020. So that led us to stock additional carp in 2021, which didn't really see that much of a change in 2021, but in 2022, we saw a dramatic decrease in Eurasian milfoil, which is a good thing. That's what we're trying to control. Unfortunately, in 2023 and 2024, we see further declines in native species, to the point where we've heard like very concerned fishermen say that the habitat is dramatically altered. And you're right, it is. So it has changed the fish behavior. They're not going to be seeking the same refuge as they were when there was a lot of aquatic plant growth in the littoral zone. You're going to find them more near rocky areas, docks, maybe along the water lily areas, because water lilies have not been eaten by grass carp yet. They're not a very palatable species for grass carp, so hopefully they will persist in the lake. But yeah, we're aware of the concern of grass carp eating plants. There's still adequate plant growth in a lot of places in Oscawana, but it's not nearly what it was before.
The hard part, as Hillary said before, is making sure we maintain the balance. It is a very important. I mean, if we take too many carp out, we will be overrun with plants and milfoil again. So we need to find the right balance and do this slowly over a period of years.
Yeah, and so something that was in the NERA report was talking about how the reduction of aquatic plants influences the way that nutrients are recycled in the water column, and that's true to some extent. The milfoil particularly, though, is really good at taking nutrients from the sediments and allowing them to like go into the water column as the plants die. So I'm hopeful that maybe the dramatic reduction in milfoil will prevent some of that movement of nutrients from the sediments in shallow water areas and mineralization into the water column. But there's also the fact that the direct loss of native aquatic plants, particularly in the zone of depth from about 3 feet to 6 feet, because 6 feet deep usually was when the milfoil became most dominant. That zone is at the same depth as a lot of the incoming groundwater, that shallower zone. And so if you don't have aquatic plants there, the algae are going to take advantage of those incoming nutrients. And that is a problem, particularly for coves like Wildwood, where there's a lot of homes and a lot of septic systems around that zone with incoming groundwater in poor quality.
Hillary, someone's asked, what's the lifespan of the grass carp?
About 20 years. So 20 years is like an ideal, like typical growth lifespan. But in cold water areas, particularly if they reduce their feed, like if they eat all of the plants in the lake, they're not going to live as long. And so there's a assumed mortality rate that we can go off of here. Another thing that grass carp do is when they eat all the plants, they rapidly change the nutrients from being in the plants to in the water column when they poop it out. Some of that is going to be accumulated into the body mass of the carp itself, but it's limited, particularly for adult-sized fish. And then somebody asked me to re-explain why the milfoil is problematic. So milfoil is, it typically grows in the deeper zones. And it's the deeper zones that start to accumulate more of the fine particles as they settle into deeper water. And it's the deeper zones that have higher concentrations of nutrients in the sediment that the milfoil can then grow. And milfoil is known to be what's considered sort of a leaky plant, where as little pieces of milfoil slough off and decompose, the nutrients that once were in the sediment from the mid-depth range waters are now in the water column. And that's just because of the growth history and research that's been done on milfoil specifically. So this is the same figure from the NEAR 2023 report. I don't have the raw data from 2023 yet, so I'll have to talk to LOMAC and see if we can get that. But ultimately, the reduction in milfoil is astounding from 2022 to 2023, and then we found none in 2024. I found one small floating fragment in the whole lake. So the grass carp has basically eradicated milfoil in Oscawana. The large-leaf pondweed, which is one of the best native plants that we can have, it's really good habitat for a lot of different fish species. It tends to grow in shallower water. That plant is only present in 2 locations in Oscawana right now, or that's the only places that we found it. We were hoping that because the carp were preferentially feeding on the milfoil, they were going to leave large-leaf pondweed alone. But unfortunately, 2023 and 2024, it's been pretty decimated. So this is definitely part of the conversation of like, when are we going to, if we are going to start trying to remove some of the carp. Similar to that, but a little, actually this one's a little different. So tape grass is a native plant that has seen a little bit of a reduction over 2020 to 2024. The 2023 figure isn't in here. It's just too much to include, and it was really similar to 2024. I think the reason why this native plant hasn't been eaten as fast as the others is because it tends to grow in shallower water. So in a lot of places, this plant is growing in like really rocky exposed shorelines in like 2 to 3 feet of water. And I think that zone, because it gets so much wave action, is actually really difficult for grass carp to feed. And so the plants there are just not actively preyed upon quite as much as the plants that are growing in deeper water. Yeah, so the harvester, somebody's asking about the harvester. I have not reviewed the harvester files from 2024 yet, so I can't comment on how much time the harvester spent removing certain types of plants and algae. But I am wondering if there's no milfoil to remove, and the harvester is still operating, if the target plants have switched. And so particularly for cyanobacteria mats, there were more cyanobacteria mats in 2022 and 2023 than there were in 2024. And I don't know if that's a factor of the harvester removing the mats or not, because these are unsightly. They tend to be accumulating mostly in the Wildwood area, and then the Northeast Cove. But I saw evidence during the survey that the harvester was actively removing those, which is a good thing. It just is difficult to compare because grass carp don't eat this, and so it has to be the harvester if you're seeing a decrease. And so to go back to this is
Hillary, let me just respond to one question that was
Sure.
part of it, which is cuttings left behind. So clearly, cuttings left behind are not ideal, but the harvester is designed to cut and remove the material that it's cut out of the lake. What it actually has a built-in conveyor system that takes the cuttings out of the lake, puts it on the harvester, and then the harvester goes back to the shore, and we have a truck where all of that stuff is trucked to a location far away from the lake. So more comes out than remains in the lake, which is why the harvester works. But there is no question that it can't scoop up 100% of what it cuts, and there are some smaller bits left in the lake, but the vast majority of it is scooped up and put on the harvester and moved.
Yeah, and so to add to that, that was the cuttings and the fragments from when there was a lot more milfoil and a lot more aquatic plants. That was more of a problem than it is now. There's just like such little milfoil in general now that like the cuttings are not really a problem. I only saw one floating fragment in the whole lake in 2024 during the survey.
Well, there was another question about, do we know how many carp were put in between the two stocking events? I have.
Yeah, 453, I think.
Well, that was the second stocking
That
event.
was the second stocking. And then the first stocking, I have it written down. I just didn't include it in this presentation, but yes, we do know. In order to come up with that estimate for the 2021 stocking, the second stocking, we did a modeling effort to determine what the likely mortality rate was over the 2016 to 2020 period. And then all we did was try to bump up the carp based back to the initial stocking rate. But clearly it was a little bit of an overshoot, which is really common with grass carp. I don't know a single case of use of grass carp where they achieved like balance. It's so hard to do that. Because when you think about it, you're stocking carp based on a surface area of a number of acres of plants. But as the carp start to eat them, the number of carp in the lake start to become too many for the dwindling number of acres of plants. And so it's sort of like a positive feedback loop where, yeah, we probably should be removing carp, in order to balance that ratio again. But I don't want to put it lightly because the grass carp are going to be expensive to remove. We're going to need to hire an electrofishing boat in order to corral them, which that in itself is probably going to be at least $10,000 just for one day of work. Which they could probably remove a large number of carp in one day, but like it's not a small investment, and we should be wary of doing it and like talk it out as a community too. So coontail is a plant that we thought was increasing, or it was increasing, which was normal based on research from grass carp stocked lakes, because this is a plant that is not palatable generally to grass carp. But at a certain point, does it become palatable because they've eaten everything else that they like already? Because we saw a dramatic reduction basically in 2024 compared to 2023 and 2022. It's also possible that the harvester is removing some of this because there's less plants to remove, but it's difficult to discern the two. I think that this is more carp related just because of the dramatic reduction that we're seeing. And this again is the cyanobacteria mats. This is like I talked about 2 years ago. These mats also produce cyanotoxins and should not be touched if possible. And it's a good thing that the harvester is now being able to spend more time removing them. And that's another thing I wanted to talk about harvesting. The harvester removes biomass, which means that it's removing nutrients. So if you're taking plants and algae accumulated from the lake and moving it out of the lake, then you've just removed nutrients from the lake. It's a small amount, but it's not like you should still consider that part of the nutrient budget. Okay, stormwater. In 2024, thanks to the work with the town and the highway department and their engineers and wetlands inspectors, the town received funding to create several stormwater runoff detention basins to treat water before it enters the Lost River. And that was completed in 2024. There are more funding opportunities specifically for watershed management. Watershed management is a problem throughout the country. There are funding revenues in New York through the Water Quality Improvement Project grant consolidated funding application that's due in July, which LOMAC and the town intends to coordinate with the highway department to potentially put in a grant for several additional projects. We're also entertaining the idea of putting in a community grant where we focus on
What's that?
allocating resources for small projects on private property. like rain gardens. So this is an ending request here is if you are interested in tailored recommendations for capturing rainwater and minimizing runoff from your property, get in touch with LOMAC. Because we would love to implement some type of a subsidized rain barrel or rain garden program or watershed water diversion and infiltration program on private property. And I think the New York City has recently started doing this, and it's gained a lot of traction and serves as a good example that we can follow. And with that, I'll just say we do our best. We plan, monitor, manage, reflect, and then adjust as needed. So I'll take questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Hillary. If anybody has any questions, please just enter into the chat and Hillary will be happy to respond.
Yeah, and okay, good to hear. Some people are in for a rain garden. Yeah, and the important thing about rain gardens is doing it correctly, because I see people do rain gardens where because there's no overflow or because the soils aren't right for the volume of water that you're trying to infiltrate, that water ends up sitting there and becoming like a stagnant pond because it won't infiltrate. So the design is critical to make it function as appropriate.
Hi, it's Jackie and Navi. I just want to verify or clarify a few things. First, Hillary, thank you. Excellent presentation as always. Great job. So thank you very much for everything you do. The grant right now that you're referring to, right now there's no grants available for Putnam Valley, Putnam County, where we can put funding towards a private entity. So that right now, these rain gardens through a grant process is not something have been eligible for.
It would be for the education part, not for the implementation.
Okay, so the actual that would be on the homeowner to actually create it. Okay, so we just need to clarify that with them, that the grant would be for education purposes, but to actually build it would be on the homeowner.
Mm-hmm.
The other grant that we did apply for with Bruce, we won't get an answer anytime soon, but the district needs to know that it is a 50-50 grant, meaning that the grant would be 50% and the district would have to pay for the other 50. But other than that, I think everything else was on point, and I appreciate everything you've done.
Okay. Sorry about there's like red marks somebody was drawing on the screen. I'm not really sure how that got there. Do you see that?
I do.
Yeah, okay. I don't know. I don't think that was me. If I did it, sorry. Zoom is weird. Rin.
Hi. Yeah,
Hey.
thank you so much for this. Just love these sessions. And yeah, phenomenal job, Hillary. Just a quick question. I love the idea of all of us chipping in on different ways to prevent runoff. So you mentioned rain gardens, rain barrels, anything else we could be doing? And then my second question is, how far away do we need to consider that? So I'm part of the Lake Oscawana community, but like not right on the water. So we have a pollinator garden, but I assume we're probably not as important as houses right on the water. So
it's all important.
Okay.
So like even the houses that are tiers up in the watershed, like you can think of those as like the headwaters for Oscawana. And basically, if you're capturing runoff from your property, that's reducing the volume of runoff that's going farther downhill. And it is like leaps and bounds easier to control runoff where it's generated, until like if you don't at your property and the volume builds up downstream, then there's a larger volume of water. It's moving faster. It's much more difficult to control. So I think that the upper watershed is equally important.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you. And so, yeah, what else should we consider besides rain barrels and rain gardens?
Lynn, if you go to the buffer zone presentation that we had from Cornell Cooperative, it's on our website.
Oh, nice.
You'll see that we recommend that buffer zones be used not only by people right on the lake, but anybody who has steep property where the water's running off their property onto the road. If you have a buffer zone there and you have a rain garden, that will be of enormous help, because as Hillary said at the outset of this presentation, anything in the watershed runs into the lake, and anything we can do to control that runoff will be a benefit to the lake. And because other than the forest lands around the lake, virtually everything is private property. We can't do anything. You have to do it.
Yep.
Another thing that we can do is we really have to think about our driveways. So we all have impervious driveways. That's what we do. But if we change them or think about changing them to pervious driveways, so with those open blocks where there's dirt and soil in between, those were done around the lake on one of our grants from about 10 years ago. So several of the parking lots have the pervious. I think that would help a lot.
I just attempted to answer one of the questions in the chat. I don't know which area. Somebody was saying there was a clear cut in Wildwood in common areas. In the past, I have used grant funding from federal and state entities to do joint property improvements, like actually construct stormwater detention on jointly owned like district property. So that is something that I have done in the past. Somebody else is asking, limiting the build out around the lake. Yeah, so it's a very difficult topic. It's trying to strike that balance between conservation of undeveloped lands and also respecting private property rights. But I like to come at it from if we can all just infiltrate the water on individual properties and minimizing runoff from your property, then like everybody's taking care of the watershed together.
I'd also like to point out that if it's talking about renovations of older houses on the lake, that actually offers us an opportunity, because if somebody's going to renovate their house and we can get them as a requirement to install a new septic system and that is further away from the lake than currently, and many of the older houses were built with very small septic systems right on the lake before anybody knew what the problem was going to be, that is a huge benefit to us. And we should think about that as a win-win. Somebody gets a renovated or new house, and we get a septic system that is not going to infiltrate into the lake.
Alan, that is encouraged by our planning and zoning board. That is not enforced. We can't force them to do that for a number of reasons, but it is highly encouraged when that occurs. It's also highly encouraged for those residents who do need to repair or replace their septic, that they go into the Fuji Clean system. It is something our planning and zoning board, our wetlands inspector, and our town engineer are working very closely with.
Great. I tried to answer some of the additional questions, but if anybody else has questions that were not addressed, feel free to say something, type in the chat, or follow up with us after the fact.
Hillary, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, very educational. As all of you can see and understand, this is a very complex ecosystem and very hard to manage, but we are doing our very best to do it. There are many inputs, there are budget limitations, there are legal limitations, and there are still many things the scientists don't fully yet know. We try and manage all that. We work very hard with Hillary to do what we can, but as I have said a couple of times during the presentation, the private homeowners around the lake can help us as much as we can help the lake. So contact LOMAC. We have a website. We'd be happy to help you in any way we can in reducing runoff from your property. With that, I think we are.
Can I just say something? Hillary, your description on this slide set of the limnology measurements was so good. It was so clear in how you did it this time. You're to be congratulated.
I hope everybody understands it. That's my ultimate goal.
Thank you all for participating in this. Anybody who wants to see it again, it'll be posted on our website. And if somebody missed it and says, they missed it, you can point to our website and it will be up there Thank you all. Hillary, thank you. It was a great presentation.
Thank you,
Thank
Hillary.
you. Bye,
Amazing.
everybody.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye, everyone.